to welcome Professor Dave Adamson from the Centre for Regeneration Excellence Wales back to UL to talk to us as part of the Critical Perspectives on Youth, Community and Social Regeneration seminar series. Professor Adamson was previously here in June 2010 to present a keynote address at the Education as a Catalyst for Regeneration conference. Following a PhD in political sociology, Dave's early sociological interests evolved into a more practice-based focus on social policy. In particular, the rise of poverty in the 1990s focused his attention on patterns of social exclusion in South Wales and the response of community-based regeneration agencies. Working in this field, Dave had 3 periods as an advisor to the Welsh Assembly Government on issues of regeneration. He has previously been a member of the Joseph Grant Neighbourhood Programme Advisory Group, as well as holding a chair in Community and Social Policy, and being director of the Programme for Community Regeneration at the University of Glamorgan. He is on record as saying that some of the most enjoyable work that he has completed has been undertaken in partnership with disadvantaged communities throughout South Wales, working alongside community members to complete extensive social audits of their issues. And he's used this experience to ensure that his other work with public sector agencies and local and central government has been informed by views derived from the community experience of contemporary poverty. In 2009, Professor Adamson was awarded the OBE for his contribution to regeneration in Wales. And today Dave is going to talk about how raising educational attainment and skills levels are a major part of the regeneration process, but that this process is subject to difficult challenges. He will speak about how conventional policy has provided widening access approaches based upon a barriers model centred on issues of access to institutions, childcare, financial support and transport. Yet tellingly, his presentation will suggest that educational attainment does not figure in the possible self-constructions of those living within our poor communities, and that this also needs to be taken into consideration. Dave?
Thank you very much. Well, it's great to be back in Limerick. Conference here 2 years ago was absolutely great conference. Really enjoyed it and learned so much. And I was really pleased to be invited back here today. So very much looking forward to our exchange in question time. Just to elaborate a little, some of that I'd forgotten, I think. But I'm currently seconded from the university to run something called the Centre for Regeneration Excellence Wales. And the purpose of that as an institution is to try and raise the skills and capacity of regeneration professionals. And we define regeneration in the broadest sense possible. Often regeneration is considered to be just a physical environment and renewing the street scene and getting the buildings right. But we're very people-focused, and we believe that there has to be an absolute combination of getting place and people working in combination with each other. And that fundamentally brings me really to the topic I want to address today, is the role of education and learning in the regeneration mix. And I hope to argue and convince you that it's an absolutely essential element of the regeneration process, but one that's often forgotten. As in Ireland, Wales is currently suffering the, I think, front of the austerity wave. You've been riding that wave a little longer than us, and we're just beginning to feel some of the deprivations of a major austerity programme by the UK government. And I thought let's just start by setting the context a little. And in Wales, some of our statistics are fairly depressing, but it's what we have to live with. We have a 32% child poverty rate, which is about the highest in the UK. It began to come down around about 2005, 6, 7, and it's gone back up in 8, 9, 10. And in fact, we have probably lost half of the progress that we made in challenging child poverty between 1997 and 2007. Half of that progress has been lost. You can't find a single expert willing to put even a single pound on whether we will meet the government targets of eradication of child poverty by 2020. In fact, most of the recent estimates are that it will rise rather than diminish, yet alone be eradicated. Welsh Assembly Government has just relaunched its anti-poverty programme, very much focusing on child poverty, and within 9 months of relaunching it, are already looking again, and they're about to have a review of that to see how we might engender better outcomes for child poverty. And that review will be taking place over the next 3 or 4 months. Amongst our young people between 17 and 24 years of age, the job seeker allowance rate is currently running at 34.1%. And that includes everyone from graduates to 17-year-old school leavers with no qualifications. So we have a massive youth unemployment problem, basically, and very little attempt by government to deal with that. The Conservative government abolished the schemes that the Labour government was running that tried to help with this. The long-term problem of the NEETs, not in education, employment or training, was rising under the Labour Party, but it in fact has accelerated dramatically since the election. General rates of unemployment, male about just over 10%, female around about the 7% mark currently in Wales. But there is an incredibly complex spatial distribution of that. And we have some key social housing estates where the economic inactivity rate, if you wanted to look at it in great detail and combine all the reasons for people not working, would be between 50 and 70%. So a massive concentration of people not in work. And new government focus on reducing the numbers on incapacity benefit. We have the highest rate of incapacity benefit in Wales of all the UK administrations. We have an austerity programme. We're new into it in many ways. I saw a presentation by one of the leading UK economists last week, current advisor to government, and his view is that we have 85% of the austerity programme yet to hit us. And yet the impacts are already there at street level, and I'm having conversations with people who are seeing their incomes reduced. So for example, on job seekers allowance from £79 a week, losing 18 of that as a result of some of the benefit reforms. And as the young woman who told me that said, 18 quid might not be much to you, but it's maybe a third of my income. So you can appreciate the impact of that kind of austerity programme, and I know you've already felt that cold wind here. And the wider welfare reform, it's too early really to assess the impact on poverty. There are a couple of reports beginning to emerge. One literally dropped into my email box last night, too late for me to even kind of assimilate and comment on for today, but suggesting that in Wales 17,000 people would disappear from the benefit system. And that report is unable to say where exactly they will go, but it would estimate that a lot of those will end up back as family dependents and supported by charities, etc. So overall, a very depressing scenario. I will get much more optimistic towards the end, I promise you. I don't know if I'll send you all the way in a mood of gloom. But that's what we're contending with. And the difficult thing, I think, for us is that this is overlaid in many of our communities on a context where recovery from the 1980s recession had not even begun, where we had 3 generations locked into patterns of behaviour that were set in place in the 1980s. And very good evidence from Joseph Rowntree that if you overlay the current recession on those post-industrial communities that never quite came out of the 1980s recession, you have a very difficult mix of social conditions to contend with. Can you hear me right over there in the corner? Are you okay?
Can, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. We've got a lovely word in Welsh called cwtch, which is everybody gets together in a nice little huddle. So if you want to come and cwtch up in this corner here, please feel free to move. But you can hear me okay, yeah? Okay, great. So that's the kind of the broad context. Some of the work I've done has identified what I call a triangle of poverty. So if you start with the basic income poverty that characterises many communities in South Wales particularly, you then get a configuration around that of poor outcomes in housing, health and education. And it becomes a self-compounding, multi-dimensional pattern of poverty. And I want to deal with one corner of that triangle today, and that's the education corner. But I wouldn't want to underestimate the impact of housing and health within the general regeneration programme. A lot of work I do in my current organisation is with housing agencies. I regularly get tours of estates that, quite frankly, I can only describe as a national shame. That we have people living in such horrendous physical fabric and surroundings in what is supposed to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. So housing absolutely critical. We also have some appalling health statistics. We have a 9-year life expectancy gap between the best performing county and the worst performing county. So your life expectancy would be 9 years less if you live in Merthyr Tydfil, which is an old iron industry town, or if you live in the rural communities of Ceredigion. So a 9-year life expectancy gap. If you go into the well life expectancy, how long you will live before you experience life-limiting illnesses, that's up to a 17-year gap. So that's a critical dimension as well. So although I'm not going to speak about health and housing today, I do want everyone to realise that these are a fundamental part of the very complex mix of regeneration. And we do have a very holistic approach in Wales. Our strapline is promoting integrated and sustainable regeneration. And the idea of integrating our policies, that they attempt to achieve impacts in all three elements of that mix, is very important. I want to talk about education today. And I think one of the key things for me is to understand it, we have to understand the pattern of social exclusion that emerges from this very complex, multi-dimensional pattern of poverty. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term social exclusion. It came into prominence in the late 1980s, particularly within the European Union context, to describe those multiple disadvantages that people experience once they fall into long-term income poverty. And really what we see is a pattern of often long-term poverty, very difficult to break out, because once you're disconnected from the labour market, it's difficult to come back in. So you're effectively excluded from that labour market. You might be excluded then from areas of the housing market, certain tenures, private home ownership, for example, and so you drop back into social housing and housing of literally last resort. And the barriers and disadvantages become multiple. And what we find as well is that those spatial concentrations become critical. So if we have whole social housing communities that are characterised by up to 80% of the population experiencing that extreme disadvantage, then you get cultural responses. I want to distance what I'm about to say from the sort of Sir Keith Joseph cultures of poverty arguments of the mid and late 1970s, but actually to identify that there are cultural impacts. If everyone in the community is living a significantly disadvantaged life with very low incomes, then you do get cultural responses to that. You do get cultures emerge. I think if I could characterise the culture in South Wales, it has become one of acceptance, that life is poor, that it doesn't matter, I can get by. I accept this, I resign myself to it. And ultimately it becomes the norm. So there's been a normalisation of poverty. It has become almost a cultural expectation. And the poor health outcomes and poor educational outcomes have also become normalised. People don't challenge that their children aren't doing well in school. They don't challenge that as they reach middle age, they enter ill health. And I'll give you some examples of that a little later. So that long-term disadvantage does have a huge impact on people's aspiration in all aspects of their life, whether it's an expectation to have a nice house, decent job, good income, good education, good health. The aspirations slowly fall downwards, and people generally become accepting of a very poor standard and quality of life. And I would describe that as a culture of poverty. Poverty produces that culture. It is not the natural culture of those people. I often meet in my work people who say, well, people just accept this. It's apathy. It's their fault. It reloads the issues onto the population experiencing it. And I would argue that actually it's a realistic adjustment to the actual reality of social existence. And I call it the social experience of poverty. It's an adjustment to the social experience of poverty. People adjust to what is possible for them. And I'll say a little bit more of that in a moment. It becomes a family culture, and I'll give you one example. I was involved with a family who were the subject of a BBC documentary 15 years ago on what we were still calling the new poverty then. It's now the very old poverty. And it was a very typical family, drawn from a social housing community. And they agreed to do a revisit 10 years, 15 years on. And I was asked to be a consultant to the programme, and having satisfied myself it wasn't going to be the usual sensationalist nonsense that we see spoken about our poor communities, I became involved and spent quite a bit of time with the family, trying to experience and understand what their existence was. Two things struck me as really indicating what the culture of that family had become. I stress from the outset, it is a warm, loving, functional family in which the children are cared for and absolutely cherished. This is not in any way your usual portrayal of the neighbours from hell or anything of that kind. This family, we looked at 3 generations. In terms of the health aspiration, one of the older daughters was approaching 45. And as part of the programme, we had a health screening done, and she was told that she was pre-diabetic, and that if she didn't lose a bit of weight, cut alcohol consumption, etc., she would be diabetic in a year. And talking to her father, the grandfather figure in the family, his line to me was, well, she's 45, but she would be, wouldn't she? It was almost a cultural expectation that by the time you reached middle age, you would experience a significant health challenge. The second one, and one more relevant for today perhaps, is of her daughter, a granddaughter of the father, had left school with 8 GCSEs at A to C grade. GCSEs are our first level school qualification. That's not a bad little package. You can do things with that. She could certainly get into further education, college, and could have done a number of courses. And with her subject profile, could have certainly done things like social care, youth work, etc., etc. And when she left school 2 years previously, had never worked. When I said to the mother, she's got a good little set of qualifications there, it would be really good, she could get to Aberdare College. And her mother said, oh, that's not possible. I said, well, why not? She said, well, she'd have to go to Aberdare every day. Aberdare was 2.5 miles from where she lived. The social boundaries of that family were the estate. They did not operate in any single role outside of that estate. Their social horizon was limited to the boundary road of that estate. And now that's quite difficult to imagine. That community is about 18 miles from Cardiff. If you walk a mile, you can pick up a rail link. When I spoke to the rest of the family, the grandparents hadn't been to Cardiff for 35 years. The parent level hadn't been in 15 years, and several of the children had never been to Cardiff. And that's an equivalence of about a £4 train ride. So that cultural separation is in many ways absolute. So you can see how a family culture can become compressed in that tight social arrangement where you literally never leave the family or the community in any function or whatsoever. And that leads to community cultures that become reinforcing of those family cultures. And as I said, this is a warm, loving family. Within a minute of being in there, you had a cup of tea in front of you. They were a pleasure to be with, but they had no cultural horizon. They were limited by the environment, the immediate environment in which they lived. So, we come to education. The way to break that kind of isolation and that social exclusion, I firmly believe, lies in the gift of education and learning, and getting people involved in a learning experience that challenges that culture and enables them to operate outside of it. Regrettably, in Wales, we have long-term educational underperformance. The latest PISA figures for last year, PISA is the international comparison of educational achievement, we have declined yet again, despite quite radical reform of our education system in Wales. There is now a lot of hope placed on the primary school age, where we have something called the foundation phase, which is a radical model of learning adopted from the Scandinavian model. And we are hoping that this is going to challenge this underperformance. But it remains very significant and failing to improve. The skills agenda is critical to the regeneration mix. If we have people leaving school without qualification and skills, it's a major barrier to labour market entry. You either fail completely to enter the labour market, or you enter it at the lowest levels in the precarious, part-time, low-paid jobs that operate at the lower levels of the labour market. And we have a critical problem that in many ways characterises the Welsh economy. We have a low-wage economy. Low wages are currently the primary cause of poverty in Wales, over and above benefit dependency. So even when people get into work, it doesn't resolve the issues, particularly of child poverty. If we can get people in at better qualification levels, however, there is a potential to improve their incomes and to move them up. The qualifications ladder is the best indicator of improving their economic performance. That enables us collectively to increase our GDP. GDP and GVA in Wales is currently below the UK standard and the European standard. We are less than 80% of both. We therefore qualify for European regional development funds. And we are in our second phase of that, and we have just learned that we qualify for a third phase. Paradoxically, that's seen as a cause for celebration because it brings European funding to us. It is actually a badge of failure. We haven't managed to achieve any improvement. In fact, it's gone down slightly during the second period of convergence funding. So that's a major contribution to that is the failed labour market entry and the high levels of economic inactivity. And finally, it has a very obvious impact onto the local economies, the circulation at local level. Many of our Welsh towns are in absolute crisis. Their shopping centres are closed. They're literally becoming ghost towns. We have the highest retail non-occupancy rates in the UK. I know you've experienced similar things in Ireland from my travels in Ireland, but this is now emerging as one of the major problems in Wales, and it's likely that our whole regeneration policy, which is currently under review, is going to shift to that as a key focus. And if you've got a more vibrant town centre, the theory is it becomes an economic node of development for the wider area. Okay, how do we tackle that kind of educational underachievement and disengagement? Well, the conventional approach has been one that looks at barriers. There are, in theory, barriers, social, economic, some cultural, to people moving, particularly into higher education. And higher education is the ultimate goal, of course, to try and get a more prosperous and qualified workforce. And the barriers perspective is very much based around the choice model. People choose not to go into further and higher education. They make choices early on that prevent them going later, but it's always seen as a choice model. That somehow our most disadvantaged populations choose not to engage with education. The solution is often a widening access approach. Glamorgan University, where I worked, was very good at this. We had a superb widening access programme. We had foundation degrees. We had a complete network of learning centres out into our hinterland where you could take up taster courses and you could progress up a learning ladder from literally a 3-day non-accredited course right up to a degree. And relatively successful. but I would argue it's skimming off the top of those people who wanted to engage but had experienced some barriers, maybe early pregnancy and teenage and then coming back a little bit later, or maybe difficult family circumstances that didn't allow you to get into education. So those who were out there and eager were skimmed off in this process. So the widening access approach, working with FE colleges, getting people in, giving them an access program and an access qualification that we recognised as entry level, was successful to an extent, but not successful at reaching into those socially excluded populations, not successful of getting down. I don't know if you've used this term in Ireland. We've got this horrible term called the difficult to reach. We talk about difficult to reach populations. I like to reverse that and talk about difficult to access services, because for some populations the services are impossible to access. I'll come to that a bit more in a moment. But our widening access programme, relatively successful at pulling people in, but I would argue not of diving down to the deeply excluded, the people who most need to benefit from engaging with education. So we did things like tackle affordability, fee reductions, scholarships, bursaries, a whole range of things that could get you in if you were on a low income. We tackled the obvious issues of access through the FE colleges, so providing routes to higher education. My Vice-Chancellor back in the mid-90s was Sir Adrian Webb, and he talked about portalism, fear of the gate. People were afraid to come through a university gate. That was the major barrier to access. So you front-load your provision out into the community and out into FE colleges so that people slowly learn to walk through that gate, and by the time they get to university they have the confidence. And some of it worked. You provide childcare, you provide transport, and you tweak the pedagogy, the learning mechanisms a little so that they're more user-friendly, there's more support mechanisms in there, and that you deliver it in friendlier ways, not necessarily chained to the sort of 9 till 5 hours of a traditional university. You do weekend learning and evening learning. But I do want to argue that that's good at skimming off the top, but not diving down into the real poor populations. And I want to ask why that might be. And I want to advocate, I think, what I call a cultural approach to educational engagement. I would argue that largely it's cultural values that prevent engagement, and it's the cultural values I spoke about earlier. That perception of an FE college as 2 to 2.5 miles away as in another social world, as somewhere you don't belong to, you wouldn't feel comfortable in, you don't feel able to engage with. That's a cultural value, it's a cultural understanding of your position vis-a-vis an important institution. You get that from your peers, from your family, from your community. It becomes self-reinforcing. It almost becomes a rejection model. If you can't access that, well, maybe your self-respect depends on you saying, don't want it, not interested, not to do with me. There's a reactive kind of culture kicks in that actually becomes anti-learning, actually becomes anti-intellectual. You almost celebrate your educational disengagement. It becomes a badge of who you are. That is a fundamentally different model to someone not making a choice to go into education. It becomes part of your identity, becomes part of who you are. We're talking then about pre-choice behaviours. Before people arrive at a choice mechanism, they have adopted an attitude that literally shuts the door on certain choices. They're not even up for consideration. They're not on the agenda. We've done a little bit of work on this myself. I'm a sociologist, and working with psychologists is a bit like kind of sleeping with the enemy, you know. Psychologists, that's all about behaviour stuff, you know, these are social processes. Well, we found it very fruitful to have conversations with psychologists, and we have used a concept from psychology called the possible self. And this is really what we construct for ourselves as we emerge into adulthood. We construct for ourselves images of what we might do in the future, of what we're capable of what's possible for us. And if you live in an incredibly restrained environment, you develop an incredibly restrained sense of possible self. You develop a mental map of who you are and who you could be, which is limited by the immediate experiences around you. So if there are no role models, if there are no people moving out into higher education and into employment, that's the possible self-construction you arrive at. It becomes very difficult to project yourself into another situation. I used the term horizon before. There is a sense of physical horizon for many of these communities, but it becomes a cultural and mental horizon. Your horizon shifts back to a possible self that's determined by your very immediate family and community experience. I'm going to pull now on two pieces of research just to illustrate how that happens in practice. We did a piece of research on people not in education, employment or training about a year ago. We're still writing this up. It should be published within about the next 2 months, I would hope. It was a client-based piece of research, so we're currently negotiating our publication rights on the material. What we found amongst young people, and we interviewed people all over Wales, rural communities, urban communities. We also have what we call valleys urban communities in South Wales. These are in our ex-coalfield communities. They're long ribbon developments, literally almost a single row of houses that weaves its way up a valley for 20 miles or more. It's a very strange urban environment, very different from a city environment, but very different from an urban environment. And so we sampled from there, from rural communities and urban city communities. And basically it was a very ethnographic approach. We got young people to tell us about their experience of leaving school and the support services that were available to them. And in simple terms, we found two cultures. We found, I suppose, what I would call a learning engaged population. They were there, they were in school, they were relatively performing well, and they knew where to go next. They knew if they mapped out their capabilities of whether that was FE or HE, so further education or higher education. They had parental support, they had teacher support. They were pretty more or less organised about what they were going to do. And then there was a learning disengaged. These were people who from the age of 13 were truant in, were very chaotic in their response to school, had very little, if any, parental support, and were leaving school effectively without any map of where they could go. They had no cultural concept of a planned entry into adulthood, of a sense of agency, literally like leaves blowing on the wind, when their actions didn't seem to have any impact on what happened to them in their minds. So literally no sense of planning, no idea of taking decisions, no idea of how to engage with the support services that were out there in terms of the careers guidance and training that was available. And basically what they were doing were continuing trajectories of failure. They had begun to fail usually in about the second year of secondary education. Often quite promising people in primary level, but the moment they entered the secondary level of education, something seemed to go wrong. And I've worked with a colleague, Professor David Egan, looking at some aspects of this, and he's now reformulating the education delivery in the Heads of the Valleys region, which is the most poor, to try and tackle some of that sort of sense of trajectory of failure. And basically, all of it stems from this lack of cultural connectedness to learning. Those in that very negative context expressed absolutely no hopes of finding work. They literally had no ambition to find work. They felt there was a wall in front of them that they couldn't climb over, and had just accepted that they were going to be like their father and their grandfather, who many of those who had been made redundant in the 1980s and had never worked. They just accepted that that was coming their way. One or two, very, very small percentages, said, I'm not going to be my dad. I'm not going to sit on the sofa watching daytime telly. But very few of them were coming up with those kind of positive statements. So it was a very kind of just a cultural acceptance of what the family was currently experiencing. And fundamentally, there was a lack of family support. Now, that sounds like a negative thing to say, but there was actually an inability of the families to support them. It wasn't a deliberate, we don't care what happens to our children. The families themselves didn't have a map of the services available. Quite critically, they often didn't have the resource. And one interview I did that really stands out in my mind, that was of a young man who'd got himself a job interview. It wasn't somewhere he could get by bus. On the morning of the interview, his mother didn't have money to put petrol in the car, and she didn't have any credit on her phone for him to ring and say he couldn't make the interview. Now, that sounds like disorganisation, chaos, poor family kind of models, but it's actually the reality of living in poverty. You don't plan day to day. You live day to day. Your budgets are fixed on a daily basis. It's almost impossible to think of a week of planning your income and expenditure. And so they probably realised on the morning that you can't get there, I haven't got petrol, and by the way, I haven't got any credit on my phone. That's the sort of cultural barrier that is almost impossible to recognise within things like the career service. So, when that young lad reported back to the career service, well, I didn't go for interview, you can imagine the reception he got to that simple disclosure. And by the way, didn't feel able to tell the reasons why, because of the stigma of not being able to do that. Another piece of research, entirely separate, but I think tells us equally some very similar things. We have something called the University of the Heads of the Valleys initiative being established, and it's a joint project between the University of Glamorgan and the University of Newport, and it deals with this Heads of the Valleys region, which is an arc across the top of the South Wales valleys, where the poverty is at its very worst. And the idea was we would get provision up into that region and make sure that there weren't physical distance barriers or transport barriers, etc., to people entering HE. And lots of the traditional access stuff being done in association. But in its first 2 years, it's barely dipped into that difficult population. Still hasn't managed to do that, despite having very open policies in terms of recruitment, etc. So they asked myself and a colleague, would we look at, was there any community learning that was out there that could be a simple route into this provision? We have quite a lot of community provision going on in very informal ways in the community. It might be community organisations putting on adult classes. We have things like housing associations training tenants to be energy wardens and street ambassadors, and doing things like NVQ level qualifications. Very basic, but nevertheless, first step on the ladder. And what they asked us to do was to work with some of those community-based informal learning providers to try and track, were there people coming out of that process who could come into higher education directly. And we did a series of focus groups with learners, lots of interviews with providers, and had a fairly pessimistic conclusion. Were there community learning routes to HE? Probably not. That there were so many barriers in the way of people accessing this level of learning, barriers to them getting to HE. And again, they were largely cultural barriers. There was a huge demand for learning. People were signing up for community provision in good numbers and were sticking with the learning. There was a bit of a revolving door syndrome, and they kept coming back around at the same level. They didn't notch up a level. They were coming back for the same sorts of courses all the time. And that was a confidence issue. They couldn't get them to make that step up into the next kind of qualification level. Fundamentally, there was a massive basic skills deficit. People were having to tackle numeracy and literacy as the starting point of this learning process. And again, that's a major barrier to labour market entry. The support requirements were enormous. These were tutors who were working in ways which would be a complete alien concept to most lecturers in FE and HE. They were practically counsellors and social workers alongside being teachers. They were helping with family issues, with debt issues, and support way beyond the academic kind of support that you might expect them to be providing. The conclusion was that even people who'd been some time in this process were not HE ready. They were a long way from being HE ready. We also felt that there were major pedagogical issues. If they did get to university, the whole learning mechanism would be wrong for them. The community provision was very much based around collective learning, was very much based around kind of group discovery, people working on issues collectively rather than individually. And we felt that would be a huge cultural wall they would hit when they got to university, when it becomes much more based around your performance, your assessment, your learning, rather than this much more collective process. And we recommended some pedagogical changes that would be required. Okay, massive problems. Are there any solutions? I think the first one has to be cultural challenge. And I think that is best done by community organisations. We have, fortunately, many in South Wales who work very actively in communities to provide children and young people, particularly, with alternative experiences. It's a kind of experiential challenge. You break that pattern of experience and limited horizon. Role of arts, sports and music has come to the fore absolutely critically as engaging young people in projects and programmes which get them out of that limited experience. And again, I did some research for the Arts Council in Wales 3.5, 4 years ago now that looked at the kind of provision. And we were talking to young people who had progressed into employment largely on the basis of generic skills they picked up in things like video projects and DJing projects and cultural projects of various kinds. And we were able to establish that there was a very clear role for breaking some of that limited experience of our poorer communities. So we have to see in this context that education is a social change agent and it has to be a part of a social change process. And very much involved in that, I think, are strong partnerships between schools and community groups. We have community groups now providing our pupil referral services for children, pupils excluded from school, rather than putting them in the kind of sin bin institutions that we used up until 4 or 5 years ago. We're now actually using partnerships with community groups to provide them with very different learning experiences. New modes of delivery emerging. I've mentioned the foundation phase, which is very much learning through play at primary level up to the age of 7. We're beginning to see more use of vocational learning at secondary level, and that role of community organisations as well to provide a learning outside the school wall is emerging quite strongly. Slightly different pedagogies emerging. Learning by experience seems to be becoming more popular, particularly the early stages of secondary level. But there is massive teacher resistance to some of this, largely because, of course, the performance indicators aren't changing. So although the schools might be very clear that they can't carry on as they are, their performance indicators actually insist that they do. So there's a major kind of policy change that has to go ahead there. Unfortunately, our current education minister, who I've got a huge respect for in most instances, has a model that says that deprived communities shouldn't have bad schools, which we would all agree with, but he doesn't accept that the social class and culture of the poor community can actually make a school poorly performing. He regards it as poor educational management by the teaching team. So what we have currently are kind of massive programs to raise the GCSE scores of our failing schools, which is a complete irrelevance to the kinds of pupils I've been talking about today. So they just get parked. They get babysat, because you can't do anything with those, but we can work at the margins and get our GCSE scores up. And in that process, some schools with the best community projects are withdrawing from them because they're not going to have an impact on their GCSE scores. We need more cultural sensitivity in schools. There's very good research done within the ESRC Teaching and Learning Research Programme, which was a 10-year programme to look at education in the UK. And one I liked very much was called the Homeschool Knowledge Exchange Project. It worked largely with people from ethnic minorities, but to make sure that the school engaged with their culture, that the school allowed them to bring artefacts and things into school that would belong into their culture. I think there's an equivalence to working with black and ethnic minority communities to actually working with working class communities. There is an equivalence of bringing the working class culture into school to recognise the kind of cultural activities that would be in those homes. It's almost an equivalent need to recognising the cultural differences with black and ethnic minorities. Parental engagement, a lot going on there in terms of we're designating all our schools in Wales now community schools, which means that they have to have a relationship with the community. Employer engagement, absolutely critical to get people into job-based learning, work-based learning, and again, some very good work being done there. The major challenges is that we are replaying the 1980s recession and its impacts, the new recession overlaying on top of those and posing a massive challenge. Bring the current recession on top of some of those long-term structural problems, and the employment market really goes into meltdown when you add those two things together. So in some areas where the 1980s recession was never recovered, and now new patterns of unemployment emerging on top of that, it becomes a huge challenge. So that collapse in our labour market accelerating quite rapidly at the moment, and the public sector cuts are having a particular impact in Wales. Wales as an economy that is the most highly dependent economy in the UK on public sector services. It's over 50% of employment comes from the public sector. So with massive retraction of the public sector, the impact on our employment and wider economy is considerable. And that general austerity impact on budgets, we're beginning to see local authorities clawing back from the third sector as their funding is diminishing rapidly. So a lot of the kind of community projects I mentioned are experiencing severe funding difficulties, and several have already collapsed and disappeared. I was at a lecture by Professor Stephen Fothergill from Sheffield Hallam recently, and he talked about a tsunami of welfare reforms coming our way. Absolute overwhelming levels of poverty that will arise from them. The most significant being reforms to housing benefit. And we have a prospect of a massive churn in population as people have to seek ever cheaper accommodation because their housing benefit entitlement gets ratcheted down the longer they're unemployed. And that's going to have a massive impact on schools and learning. And this is probably the major policy concern because it's outside of the gift of our Welsh Government to do much about that. This is UK government policy. And Stephen Fothergill predicts a rising tide of poverty as a consequence of that. I did say I was going to end on an optimistic note, and I'm not sure I have, but I think there is a huge mood in Wales to try and do something. There's a bit of a kind of a finger in the dike sort of fear that we are literally just trying to plug a hole in something that's about to explode in front of us. But I do hope that the Welsh Government has a very distinctive, different policy base from the UK Government, and wherever we can, we're trying to make that difference in the way we deliver public services. So there is optimism in Wales, but there is realism as well about the challenges we face. Okay, thank you.